You're watching the dirtiest player in the game. The Alpo Story Part 1. Sit back and relax. Alpo Martinez was a notorious American drug dealer from Harlem, New York City. He became famous in the 1980s and expanded his drug trades to Washington and other cities. In the history of drugs in America, Martinez is one of its most notorious. Cautionary tales. His legacy live in the world of hip-hop, the genre that was still in its relative infancy during his apex. Over the years, the name Alpo has woven itself into songs from artists such as 50 Cent, AZ, Nas, Meek Mill, Shine and Future. His legacy in rap, much like in the streets, has always been divisive. This is his story. Albert Geddes Martinez, born June 8, 1966 in the Spanish Harlem section in Upper Manhattan of New York City. Martinez, who is of Puerto Rican descent, was one of 4 children raised by his single mother. He has an older sister, a younger sister named Monica and an older brother named Placo. Placo had mental issues. People in the neighborhood say he was a complete nutcase. Placo was even accused of trying to rape and murder a female when he was younger. Martinez attended PS 5382 in the Bronx from elementary school up to the 6th grade. Then, he attended St. Lucy's Catholic School and went to Automotive Mechanical High School in Brooklyn. He also attended Julia Richmond High School before dropping out his sophomore year. Martinez grew up in East River Projects. The neighborhood was mostly black and Puerto Rican, with a few white families still living there. East River is only one of the 4 projects in the middle of Spanish Harlem. New Metro North, Old Metro North and Wilson projects are the other 3. East River was the biggest of the 4 projects with a total of 29 buildings. 23 of those buildings were 6-story buildings with 5 apartments on each floor. The Martinez family lived in the building on 105th and 1st Avenue. Family members gave Albert the nickname Alpo. The name come from the popular dog food. Alpo and his younger sister Monica were very close. Some say they were best friends. They always had each other backs. Alpo and Monica had an unbreakable relationship. Growing up in East River Projects wasn't so bad in the 70s. Block parties often took place. The big park in the back of East Rivers, as well as the basketball court, is where the parties took place. DJ Dollar Bill from Wilson Projects would set up his equipment using power from someone's apartment and people would jam for hours. Alpo spent summers away from Harlem as a child at fresh air camps. He became close to a family by the name of the Clintons. The Clintons were a wealthy family who were a part of the Fresh Air Fund program. The Clintons had a child who was around Alpo's age. The family fell in love with Alpo and wanted to adopt him by the time he was 16 years old. Alpo began running the streets at an early age. For money, him and his friends mugged people. Around 1979, Alpo began dealing heroin for an older drug dealer from the neighborhood by the name of Petaway. Alpo was a good worker. He got up every morning around 5 o'clock and made his way to Amsterdam to supply addicts with heroin. By noon, he was out of product and had a stack of cash. Alpo was only 13 years old and was Petaway's best worker. Young Alpo even took sparring and boxing lessons with former professional boxing champ Wilfredo Benitez. But Alpo was only interested in making money. He had no fear, and that was attractive to the older criminals. A guy by the name of Randy Love lived across the street from Alpo in Wilson Projects. Love was allegedly a stone-cold killer who terrorized Harlem. He formed a crew of wild stick-up kids and went around robbing and killing drug dealers in Harlem. Love took a liking to Alpo. He took Alpo under his wing and used him to set up robberies. They robbed mostly Dominicans. Randy is the one who allegedly turned Alpo into a killer. There were rumors that they once murdered a cash carrier that used to pick up the cash on a 112th Street dope spot. The cash belonged to hustlers from the Lower East Side, and this led to more bodies dropping. Alpo stayed in the swing of things. His first car was a 1977 Chevy Malibu. This was around 1982, Alpo bought a blue 5-speed Toyota Corolla while attending Julia Richmond High School. Alpo became very popular. Not only was he young making a lot of money, Alpo was a natural ladies' man. He had a reputation for sleeping around with different females. Around this time, a skating rink by the name of Rooftop was a popular hangout spot. Alpo used to park his Toyota on the sidewalk to get more attention. Rooftop was a young Rich Porter's hangout spot as well. Rich and his partner LA were more popular than Alpo at this time. They were making more money as well. LA and Rich were making good money dealing heroin uptown. Alpo crashed his Toyota shortly after purchasing it. He just left the car at the scene and hopped in a taxi. Alpo and Randy Love were done being stick-up kids. They began dealing dope for some big names and eventually branched off. It's alleged that Randy Love made Alpo a ruthless killer. They allegedly murdered several people together in the early 80s. People in Spanish Harlem feared Alpo and Love. Not only were they both known to murder people, Randy Love had a whole crew of murderers behind him. Love stayed in and out of jail, while Alpo stayed out on the streets making money. Love and Alpo had a Batman and Robin relationship. Making money was important to Alpo. When the heroin money slowed down, Alpo crossed over the cocaine. There were a lot of Spanish and Dominican hustlers in Spanish Harlem who had access to unlimited cocaine. Even the Italians were loaded with product. If you were African American, you had to be well connected to deal with a top supplier. Alpo spoke Spanish fluently, so it was easy for him and Randy Love to find a supplier. One of Alpo's favorite movies was the 1973 blaxploitation film The Mac. Some say he tried to talk like the character Goldie, who's portrayed by Max Julien. He wanted to be like Harlem hustler Nickey Barnes as well. Alpo was always into fashion. He liked how Nickey Barnes dressed in the 70s. A young Alpo had designed his own character and would soon become legendary. The guy by the name of Winky taught Alpo how to ride a motorcycle and do stunts. Alpo was a fast learner and was doing wheelies up and down the streets of Harlem in no time. By 1984, Alpo and Rich Porter had established a relationship. Rich went to serve a year in jail. Around this time, uptown hustler AZ Faison was a top player in the game. He was selling some of the best cocaine in New York City. Young Alpo understood what he could do in the East Side with AZ product. He reached out to AZ and AZ told him, if Rich say you cool, we'll do business. Rich called AZ the very next day from jail. When AZ asked him about Alpo, Rich informed AZ that Alpo was cool. AZ told Alpo to meet him at one of his stash spots. Boogaloo informed AZ that Alpo is outside waiting to see him. AZ tell Boogaloo to tell Alpo to wait till he finished bottling up cocaine. Alpo allegedly waited hours outside on his dirt bike. AZ eventually gave Alpo 8 ounces of pure cocaine on consignment. Alpo quickly became AZ's best worker. Alpo was moving the product fast in East Harlem. Times when he didn't move it fast enough. He used money from his stash to pay AZ. AZ took a liking to Alpo. Not only was Alpo a good worker, he protected AZ as well. People in Harlem feared Alpo. He was known to be a killer because he ran with Brandy Love. AZ was running a coke spot on 145th Street. He had opened an arcade and called it the Buke Box. AZ hid the drugs in the game machines in case the place was raided. The spot was making up to $80,000 a day. AZ and his crew would break down 2 kilos at a time and place a little under a half a gram of pure cocaine in small bottles. The bottles made the coke look larger. Customers believed that they were getting a whole gram for only $10. Customers traveled across town for AZ product. Hustlers began losing clientele. The jukebox became a target for the stick-up kids. Every other week it was robbed. AZ was ready to switch locations. He held a meeting and offered the jukebox to members of his crew. Everyone turned down AZ offer. Alpo happily accepted the offer. First, Alpo had a mess to clean up. He refused to get robbed like AZ, so he had a few stick-up kids killed. Alpo was now making real money. He was now getting 10 kilos at a time from AZ. Their relationship became tighter. Alpo was still living with his mother in East River Projects. He would bring trash bags filled with money in his mother's apartment, and him and his sisters would stay up all night counting the money. He was now a target in his neighborhood. Stick-up kids would hide in the hallway and wait for Alpo to come out of the apartment to rob him. He taught his mother and sisters how to handle a Uzi submachine gun in case the stick-up kids made it in. Everyone knew that Alpo kept his money at his mother's place. AZ bought Alpo a car, even gave him an apartment at the Lenox Terrace. AZ kept kilos and $100,000s at the apartment. Gave Alpo the combination to the safe so he could handle business when AZ wasn't around. According to AZ, Alpo never crossed him. The two loved and respected each other. When Rich Porter was released from jail, him and Alpo became close friends. The two hustlers had a lot in common. They both grew up in a single-parent home. They both began dealing drugs at the age 13 and they both loved nice clothes, cars and jewelry. The two took a liking to each other. They became a power duo in Harlem. Rich was the man uptown and Alpo was the man on the east side. Rich and Alpo took styling to another level. Alpo stood out a little bit more than Rich did. Rich would wear nice expensive clothes, nice expensive jewelry, but didn't overdo it. His favorite sneakers were white Reeboks. Dealers who made less money than Rich wore bigger jewelry. Rich had a classy style. He didn't have to overdo it to stick out. Alpo's style was loud. He made an entrance everywhere he went. He's the one who made Dapper Dan's what it was. Alpo was getting outfits and jackets made by Dapper Dan. He took street fashion to another level. Celebrities such as Mike Tyson, LL Cool J, Bobby Brown, Big Daddy Kane among others all followed the trend. Rich and Alpo were like superstars. Not only did they purchase vehicles and party together, they took trips and shared women. As I said before, Alpo had a thing for sleeping with other guys' girlfriends. Him and Rich Porter both allegedly had relationships with love and hip-hop star Chrissy Lampkin when she was a teenager. One day while hanging out at the jukebox, Alpo meets AZ cocaine supplier. The supplier came looking for AZ to deliver some good news. AZ was at his new coke spot at the time. That gave Alpo a chance to talk to the supplier. The supplier agreed to work with Alpo. AZ was no longer Alpo's supplier. This was the beginning of Alpo Kingpin days and the ending of the jukebox. Alpo began taking major losses at the jukebox. His top worker, who went by the name Jay, began losing large quantity of the product often. The jukebox was becoming a headache to a 20-year-old Alpo. He decided to become a wholesale supplier. Crack had just started taking over the streets. Street dealers began cooking up cocaine, making more money off of kilos. Alpo didn't sell crack. He only sold kilos of top-quality cocaine. Around this time he was been supplied by multiple high-level suppliers. Alpo met a new supplier. The supplier would sell him 60 kilos at a time, charging him $13,000 a kilo. Times when Alpo Connect wasn't around, he went to Rich. Rich charged him a few thousand extra for each kilo. Alpo didn't mind at the time. He understood that Rich had to make some kind of profit. Alpo met a female by the name of Karen at a Petty Label concert in 1988. Karen and her friends were from Washington, D.C. Attracted to Alpo designer clothes and nice car, the females approached him and sparked the conversation. They eventually exchanged numbers and kept in touch. Karen and her friends had a thing for drug dealers. They were already dating big-time hustlers in D.C., so being around wealthy men wasn't new to them. Alpo was attracted to them as well. He couldn't wait to go back to New York City to tell Rich about these females. Weeks later, Alpo invited Karen and her friend Inga up to New York. He wanted to show them that he was making real money. Alpo set Rich up with Karen's friend Inga. Days before the girls arrived, Alpo decides to buy a Porsche. Him and Rich went to New Jersey and bought turbo Porsches. Karen and Inga come to New York and stay for a weekend. The weekend went just as planned. The girls were very impressed. Karen and Alpo kept in touch with each other. She would eventually invite him to DC to stay with her and her family. Karen was very popular in DC. She knew all of the big-time hustlers and killers. As I said before, she even dated a few of the big-time hustlers. Karen's mother and sisters fell in love with Alpo. He paid all of the bills, bought the family vehicles and gave everyone money his entire stay. Karen and her sister began taking Alpo to all of the hotspots in DC. He attracted the attention of all of the hustlers. Some people even thought that he was an undercover agent. The hustlers in DC didn't like when hustlers from New York City came on their turf and made money. A lot of New York hustlers were popping up dead in DC around this time. Alpo decided to play everything cool. He bumped into a guy from his old neighborhood who was making money in DC at the time. The guy ran with a crew of DC hustlers who protected him. Soon, Alpo would do the same thing. Around this time, a guy by the name of Raphael Edmond was the biggest player in DC. He was allegedly moving up to 2,000 kilos a week. His organization, which employed 150 people, committed over 30 murders in only 1 year. Edmond was arrested on April 15, 1989 at the age of 24. His arrest and subsequent trial were widely covered by local and national media. With Edmond gone, the streets in DC became really dry. More hustlers from New York City decided to come down to DC to make money. Before Edmond was arrested, him and Alpo had met a few times. Edmond didn't think much of Alpo. Edmond once said, I quote, "Alpo couldn't F with me. And he knew he couldn't F with me." When Edmond was arrested in '89, DC basically became an open market. The crack dealers in DC no longer had a good supplier. Alpo was introduced to a young crack dealer by the name of Andre Johnson, aka Tank, and his crew ran a crack spot on 16th Street. The crack spot was making thousands of dollars a day. Tank and his crew had saved up enough money to buy a kilo of cocaine. Their New York supplier refused to sell them cocaine that wasn't already cooked up. Tank decided to find another supplier. There were plenty of New York hustlers in DC before Alpo. Some of those hustlers warned guys in DC about Alpo long before he arrived. Dementio Benson was a drug dealer from Brooklyn, New York who ran a crack operation in DC. Around 1987, he hooked up with some guys from Montana projects and made thousands of dollars. The guys in Montana projects nicknamed him Montana. Dementio was friends with Rich Porter and Alpo. His wife was good friends with Alpo's wife. So they all hung out. Dementio was one of the people who made Alpo consider going to DC. Dementio told his DC crew all about Alpo. They knew he was going to be trouble before he even arrived. The young DC crew was eventually introduced to Alpo and began buying kilos. Tank and his crew was moving the product so fast it made Alpo nervous. Alpo was bringing in anywhere from 30 to 60 kilos at a time and was profiting around $7,000 off each kilo. Alpo was protected by young killers. One of the young killers introduced Alpo to the infamous Wayne "Silk" Perry. Wayne Perry is the most infamous gangster to ever walk the streets of Washington, D.C. He was allegedly involved in over 100 murders. Perry began killing at an early age. At 14 he committed his first murder. A young Wayne Perry shot his older cousin friend in the head 6 times. One of Alpo's shooters by the name of Lil Pop was a 15-year-old killer. Lil Pop and Perry were close friends. Although Lil Pop was younger, Perry had a lot of respect for him. According to Perry, he was plotting to kill Alpo before they became friends. A female had allegedly told Perry that Alpo was talking bad about him. Lil Pop asked Perry not to kill Alpo. Perry agreed and was arrested shortly after. His bond was $10,000 and he didn't have the money. Alpo decided to bond Perry out of jail. He knew that he could take over DC with Perry and his crew of killers. You're watching The Dirtiest Player in the Game. The Alpo Story Part 2. Sit back and relax. Meanwhile, back in Harlem, New York, Rich Porter was getting super rich. He wasn't only moving up to 100 kilos at a time, he was also selling crack cocaine. Rich ran multiple crack spots that were making millions of dollars. Around this time he was dealing with a guy by the name of Fritz. Fritz was allegedly giving Rich up to 100 kilos on consignment. The only problem with Fritz was that he would go months without product, forcing hustlers to deal with other suppliers. AZ was no longer a major player in the game. After getting shot 9 times back in '87, he was no longer motivated. He became content with moving only 1 kilo at a time. Things in DC were still going good for Alpo. He was only supplying 5 to 6 people. His biggest customer was a guy by the name of Big Head Gary. Gary was a DC hustler who was making just as much money as Alpo. Not only was Gary a big-time hustler, he was a killer as well. Gary and his 18-year-old brother Brandon was the leader of a crew by the name of the Trinidad Mob. The Trinidad Mob was a crew that sold crack cocaine in the Trinidad area. Near Gallardo College in Northeast Washington, they were at war with Rayful Edmonds' crew. On June 23, 1988, one of Edmonds' guys shot Brandon in front of hundreds of onlookers. Brandon was shot twice in the back and, as he lay wounded on the ground, his assailant stood over him and shot him several more times. Brandon had allegedly disrespected Edmonds in front of hundreds of people hours before he was killed. Hundreds of people watched Columbus Daniels, aka Nut, shoot Brandon down in the street. Several more shootings followed the Terrell killing. Leaders from the 2 rival drug groups met in July of that year to call a truce. Some say that Edmonds paid Big Head Gary $1 million to end the war. Big Head Gary and Tank were Alpo's 2 main customers in DC. Both were spending hundreds thousands of dollars at a time. Alpo began sleeping with Tank's girlfriend. Tank eventually found out about it but never confronted Alpo. The two continued doing business. Alpo even fell in love with the female and bought her family a house in Maryland so they could spend more time together. The basement part of the house belonged to Alpo. He became close to the female's family and was on the verge of leaving his wife. People didn't know that Alpo was a married man. Around 1987 he married his wife Natasha. Alpo was a father also. He had kids by multiple females. Everything was going good for Alpo. He had homes and condos in New York, Maryland and DC. He had the newest vehicles and he was making the most money he ever had made. One day when Rich Porter was out of product, he asked Alpo to supply his cousin Peanut with 125 grams of cocaine. Alpo agreed to and Peanut travels to DC to pick up the product. Months later Peanut and his girlfriend Cheryl Gilbert were indicted on federal charges. They both were facing life in prison. The couple decided to cooperate with the feds. This was right before the death of Rich Porter. Peanut chose not to snitch on his cousin Rich and on Alpo instead. They told the feds that Alpo was their cocaine supplier and that they bought over 500 kilos from him in just 1 year. According to Alpo, it was all a lie. He said that he only supplied Peanut with drugs once. By the end of '89, Alpo was indicted. The drug case was resulted in the conviction and life imprisonment of Peanut and his girlfriend. During the course of that trial, several witnesses testified that Alpo was the supplier and that members of the drug ring were involved in several killings. According to Alpo, he knew that he was wanted by the feds. He continued living life and doing business in DC. His relationship with Wayne Perry and Big Head Barry was growing stronger. After getting bonded out of jail by Alpo, Perry was ready to make some real money. Him, along with Little Pop, both became Alpo's muscle. Little Pop, also known as Shorty Pop, was a member of the famous go-go band the Junkyard Band. They were signed to Def Jam Records and their hit single Sardine sold over 1 million copies. Little Pop wasn't making much money with the band. He began hanging out with his uncle and other older hustlers and began catching bodies at an early age. Little Pop and Alpo met around '88. They began hanging out and eventually became close. Little Pop tried to protect Alpo the best he could, but the teenager needed a little help. On December 6, 1989, a guy by the name of Matthew Blake was killed by Lil Pop. Blake was just 24 and the father of an infant daughter. Shorty Pop was on the run from the cops. He was wanted for murder and rape in Prince George's County. Pop was also wanted for the murder of 29-year-old Tony Kenyon in 1987. 1990 was a cold year for Alpo. He started the year off with killing his close friend, Richard Porter. On January 3, 1990, Alpo and Big Head Gary came to New York to pay Rich and to get more product on consignment. Rich was now on a higher level in the drug game. Everyone believed he was a millionaire. Some say that Alpo became a little jealous of Rich. Rich had a few suppliers who would give him up to 100 kilos at a time on consignment. He hardly used his own cash to buy product. Sometimes he would give Alpo kilos on consignment. Alpo was one of Rich's best customers. He was spending up to $400,000 at a time. Rich was making a lot of money in Harlem. He was planning on moving to Florida with his girlfriend and children. But things didn't work out that way. His little brother Don L. Porter was kidnapped in December of '89. The kidnappers demanded $1 million from Rich. According to Alpo, he gave Rich $100,000 to help get Don L. back. Alpo was on vacation in Florida at the time. Alpo still decided to murder Rich. He claimed that Rich was beating him out of money. Many people believed that Alpo murdered Rich out of jealousy and greed. After killing Rich, Alpo and Big Head Gary went looking for AZ. According to AZ, Alpo was plotting to murder him the same night. Alpo and Big Head Gary was parked outside of one of AZ's spots at the Lenox Terrace. AZ pull up with a female. He get out and walk towards the building. Alpo calls him to his Jeep. Friend of AZ seen Alpo parked outside the Lenox Terrace and warned AZ not to go over there. AZ listens. He tells Alpo to wait and then he goes to get a gun from his condo. It took AZ a long time to come back outside. When he returned, everyone but his date were gone. AZ knew something wasn't right. Alpo and Big Head Gary went back to DC with 30 or more kilos that they took from Rich. Alpo still attended Rich's wake a week later. A lot of people blamed Alpo for Rich's murder. A guy by the name of Stanley was killed days after Rich's body was found. Stanley was close friends with AZ and Rich. Some say Alpo had Stanley killed. Alpo helped the Trinidad mob go to war with other crews. In March of 1990, just months after murdering Rich Porter, Alpo was shot at a car wash. He was there allegedly meeting a guy by the name of Jawbreaker. Jawbreaker was affiliated with the Trinidad mob. Alpo was dropping off weapons and a vehicle so Jawbreaker and his guys could take down a rival crew. Jawbreaker and his guys had something else in mind. Instead of helping Alpo and the Trinidad mob take down the crew, Jawbreaker decided to try kidnap Alpo and robbing him. Jawbreaker and his guys attempt to kidnap Alpo. Alpo break and run and Jawbreaker allegedly shoot him in the back. Jawbreaker and his crew then flee the scene. Alpo was rushed to the hospital and then was flown on a helicopter to another hospital shortly afterwards. He barely survived surgery and was now in recovery. Doctors wasn't sure if he would make it. Karen and her family rushed to the hospital to see Alpo. Alpo was on a breathing machine fighting for his life. He didn't think he'd pull through. FBI agents was informed that Alpo was in the hospital and was about to die. Agents who was investigating Rich and Don L. Porter murders rushed to the hospital to interview Alpo. The agents believed that Alpo was involved in Rich and Don L. murders. Alpo began telling the agents everything about his drug organization. Not only was Alpo drugged up, he thought that he was gonna die. Shortly after being interviewed by the agents, Alpo felt well enough to escape from the hospital. He quickly recovered at home and then got right back to business. That was his second time getting shot. The first time he was shot was a few years earlier when he ran the jukebox. A crew of brothers who were hustling near the jukebox were upset about losing their clientele to Alpo. The group of brothers were the Fluellen brothers. The Fluellen brothers was a group of brothers who were known to be killers. George Fluellen allegedly shot Alpo in the leg. Many believe that was the real reason Alpo closed down the jukebox and went to DC. After recovering from being shot in the back, Alpo was ready to put Wayne Perry and his crew to work. It was now time to get dirty. Alpo quickly adapted to the culture in DC. He became a fan of go-go music and became very popular in the city. He hung out at all the hot spots and slept with a lot of females. He had a child with a female by the name of Fuzzy. Fuzzy was a popular young lady who slept with many of the DC hustlers. Fuzzy was even sleeping with Tank's young partner, Spark. An up-and-coming rapper by the name of Fat Rodney was taking over the underground hip-hop scene in DC. He's known for his local hip-hop go-go classic song Bussing Out. He would often perform at nightclubs and rap battle other DC MCs. The streets in DC loved Fat Rodney. He was allegedly a big-time crack dealer from the Northwest Side. Fat Rodney hung out with guys such as Raphael Edmond and Michael Frey. Everyone in DC expected him to be a huge rap star. Alpo and Fat Rodney allegedly had a business relationship. Sadly, on June 16, 1989, Fat Rodney was gunned down leaving a party at the Crystal Skating rink. He was just 21 years old. Many say he was only trying to break up a fight. The case remains unsolved. Alpo met a guy by the name of Manny. Manny was a gay man who hung out at go-go clubs. He was very popular in DC and he hung around a lot of females. Manny was a good cook and dancer. Him and Wayne Perry were close friends. Wayne and his crew often hung out at Manny's house. Alpo took a liking to Manny. Not only could Manny cook, he was hilarious. He kept people laughing and smiling. Being gay in DC wasn't a big deal back then. Some of the biggest hustlers and killers secretly participated in gay sex. Alpo was aware of this. In the late 80s, a dance by the name of the Butt was very popular in DC. The song by the go-go band Experience Unlimited was an instant hit and performed on the classic film School Days by Spike Lee. Spike Lee also directed the music video. When the song was played in clubs, both females and males would poke out their behinds and shake it. They was twerking before twerking was the word. Some of the big-time hustlers were in the go-go clubs doing the butt. Alpo and Big Head Gary became good friends and business partners. Big Head Gary began driving new expensive vehicles motivated by Alpo and other New Yorkers. People thought Gary was driving Alpo cars. Alpo was surrounded by murderers. He himself was a murderer as well. After getting shot in the back, he was ready for some people to die. Michael Salters aka Frey was an older hustler in DC. He made millions of dollars in the DC streets. Frey was a well-established and respected hustler. Frey allegedly didn't take kindly to New York hustlers coming from up top to set up shop in Chocolate City. The slick New York hustlers would come down to DC with drugs and game, showing off jewelry, cars and sleeping with all the DC females. When Alpo came into town with a New York game, Frey called his bluff and allegedly gotten kilos from Alpo and never paid it. Frey had a lot of pull in DC. He was generating millions of dollars from handling premium DCP, marijuana, cocaine, and especially heroin. Him and Raphael Edmond had a business relationship. Frey was regarded as the ambassador of Chocolate City. His reach extended to seemingly anywhere. He was loved by friends, musicians, professional athletes, politicians, prison inmates, and so many random onlookers that caught a glimpse of him. Frey wanted Alpo gone. The Trinidad mob refused to go to war with him over Alpo. Even Wayne Perry knew that it would be difficult getting to Frey. One of Frey's men by the name of Michael Anthony Jackson allegedly owed Frey money for a kilo of cocaine. Jackson reached out to Wayne Perry and Alpo and offered to kill Frey for a fee. Alpo agreed to pay Jackson a half of kilo and $9,000. That was the day Michael Jackson joined Alpo's organization. Michael set up a meeting with Frey on the night of July 16, 1991. Salters was waiting in his car at the intersection of 1st Street Northwest and Bryant Street Northwest when an unidentified gunman pulled up and shot him 6 times. Frey's brother was nearby observing in a van and ran into Frey's car to drive his dying brother to medical aid. Frey was left at the entrance of Washington Hospital Center around 10:30 p.m. and declared dead at 1 a.m. He was 38 years old. Wayne Perry along with Jackson, Shorty Pop and a guy by the name of Tyrone Price made Alpo, a feared man in DC. The deadly crew went on a killing spree. Evelyn Carter and several friends who were walking north from the Constitution Hall, leaving a Keith Sweat concert, suddenly were confronted by Wayne Perry at around 11 p.m. Perry shoots Carter multiple times. She fall to the sidewalk just outside the General Services Administration building. Carter's friends ran inside the building to call for help, and a neighborhood resident went to Carter's side to comfort her. Evelyn Carter was taken by police to George Washington University Hospital and was later pronounced dead. She was 20 years old. The shooting took place just 2 blocks from the White House. Evelyn Carter was an ex-girlfriend of Wayne Perry. She was allegedly killed for compromising Perry at the Keith Sweat concert. Wayne Perry also murdered 24-year-old Yolanda Burley and a lady by the name of Alveda Hawkins, aka Penny. Penny was a crack smoker who witnessed Perry murder a guy by the name of James Henson, aka Froggy, years prior. Perry was waiting on the right time to murder Penny. According to Alpo, Perry murdered Froggy at a gas station for talking trash. Penny was hanging out with Froggy when it happened. One late night at around 3 a.m., Alpo, Wayne Perry, Tyrone Price and a female friend of Perry were hanging out in the southwest neighborhood. Perry was informed that Penny was nearby buying crack cocaine. They all were sitting in Perry's MPV van that Alpo recently bought him. Alpo was asleep in the passenger seat while Perry and Price waited for Penny. Penny was spotted walking up the alley. Price snuck up on Penny, then proceeds to put her in a chokehold. He carry her back to Perry's van and throw her in the back seat. Alpo hop out of the van and gets in his Ford Mustang. Perry's female friend hop behind the wheel of the van and Perry puts in a cassette tape. He plays the song A B Is a Bee by the rap group NWA. As the song play, Perry stabs Penny multiple times with a switchblade knife. After stabbing Penny, Perry shoots her several times. After murdering Penny, Alpo, Perry and Price dumped her body on the 295 highway. They then stopped by one of Perry's children's mother's house to clean out the van. According to Alpo, there were pieces of brains everywhere in the van. Back in New York, Alpo was a hated man. Everyone believed that he killed Rich Porter and his 12-year-old brother Donnell. Alpo's wife Natasha had gotten into an argument with Dementio Benson. Dementio had allegedly smacked Natasha and dared her to tell Alpo. Dementio and Alpo had spoke over the phone and eventually made peace. In the summer of '91, Dementio came down to DC with Boogaloo and several others to play in the basketball tournament. He meets Alpo at Kennedy's Park. Alpo was in the middle of a basketball game. Dementio walks up to shake his hand. As they shake hands, Shorty Pop walks up and shoots Dementio in the head. Boogaloo and the other guys break and run, leaving a severely wounded Dementio behind. A couple of guys on the basketball court continue to take shots at the basket as Dementio lay on the ground bleeding. The word gets back to NYC. The Benson family were informed about Dementio's death. Alpo acted as if he had nothing to do with it. He even sent his wife over to the Benson family home with flowers and money. That same summer, Alpo's former good customer Andre Tank Johnson was murdered as well. Tank was sleeping with Big Head Gary's girlfriend Caprice. Months before being murdered, Alpo warned Tank to stop fooling around with Caprice. Tank agreed to stop sleeping with Caprice, but then decided to sleep with her one last time. After sleeping with Caprice one last time, Tank changed his cell phone and deeper numbers. Caprice gets upset and lied to Big Head Gary, telling him she's pregnant by Tank. Big Head Gary call and tell Alpo. They then plot to kill Tank. Around this time, Tank and his crew were being supplied by a Colombian. They were no longer spending money with Alpo. Business in DC wasn't the same for Alpo. Alpo was missing. At $400,000 to $500,000 a month from Tank. Not only was Alpo missing the money, he was missing Tank's fiancée Michelle. Tank and Michelle had decided to work on their relationship. She was no longer going to her family's house in Maryland to see Alpo. One day when Tank and his crew were running low on product, Tank decided to purchase some kilos from Alpo. Their Colombian supplier wasn't around and Tank didn't want to wait. Tank meets up with Alpo. Alpo hop in Tank's caravan. As Tank go to the back of the van to get the cash, Big Head Gary approached the van. When Tank come back to the front of the van, Gary shoots him. Alpo then hopped behind the wheel of the van and tell Big Head Gary to follow him in his car. They then drove several blocks away and parked Tank's caravan in the Kenilworth neighborhood. Tank was found dead in the back of the caravan days later. Alpo and Big Head Gary took $270,000 from Tank. Alpo gave Big Head Gary $100,000 and kept the rest for himself. Not only did Alpo get $170,000, he now had Michelle all to himself. Michelle quickly went back to her family house in Maryland. Tank's close friend Spark was ready to go to war. He would eventually catch up to Big Head Gary and shoot at him. After missing every shot, Spark run off. Big Head Gary was now ready to kill Spark. Shortly after murdering Tank, Big Head Gary and Alpo friendship began fading away. Big Head Gary was tired of being looked at as Alpo's sidekick. He was making more money than Alpo at the time and wanted everyone to know that. He began disrespecting Alpo and talking bad about him behind his back. On a few occasions, he even called Alpo's wife the B word. Big Head Gary and Alpo wasn't no longer hanging out. Wayne Perry remained loyal to Alpo. They began hanging out every day. It was hard for the FBI to watch Perry because of Alpo. The crew would stay at different spots every other night. They stayed at hotels, a bunch of different female houses and even Manny's house. They would come out late nights and go in before sunrise like vampires. On October 21st of that year, Wayne Perry and his crew shot and killed 23-year-old Mark Mullen and 24-year-old Timothy Brunell Cohen at Sam's Car Wash in Maryland. Over 50 rounds of ammunition were fired at the two men in broad daylight. Witnesses spotted Perry's van at the scene. Next day, Alpo and Wayne Perry decided to kill Big Head Gary. Alpo had been working on a huge deal with a Colombian supplier in New York. Alpo needed to come up with $2 million. He asked Big Head Gary to give up only $500,000 and he was gonna cover the other $1.5 million to secure the deal. Big Head Gary went behind Alpo's back telling people about the deal. He wanted everyone to know that he had more money than Alpo. This was embarrassing to Alpo. He was ready to get rid of Big Head Gary. Big Head Gary was ready to get revenge on Jawbreaker and Spark for shooting at him weeks earlier. He called up Alpo telling him that he knew Jawbreaker and Spark's location. Alpo, Wayne Perry, Tyrone Price and Michael Anthony Jackson went to meet Big Head Gary by the Wendy's on Florida Avenue. Big Head Gary parks his truck and hops in the van with Alpo and the crew. After attempting looking for Jawbreaker and Spark, Alpo stops at a gas station to get gas. After getting gas, the guys ride around for 10 more minutes. Alpo give Price the signal. Price, who was sitting behind Big Head Gary, shoots him in the back of the head twice. After shooting Big Head Gary, they strip him naked and drag his body through the woods. Near Rock Creek Park, Big Head Gary's body was found the following day. Many believed that Alpo had Big Head Gary killed to steal his money. Alpo knew where Big Head Gary kept his stash. Alpo was allegedly sleeping with Karen's sister Inga after her and Rich Porter dated. Inga then began dating Frey. When Frey was killed, she gave the police information about Alpo and Wayne Perry, because she allegedly thought that Alpo had Frey killed to be with her. Just 2 weeks after killing Big Head Gary, Alpo and his wife Natasha were pulled over by the FBI and DC police after midnight leaving Manny's house. Natasha attempted to put the car in drive to get away but wasn't successful. Her and Alpo both were pulled out of the vehicle and arrested. Alpo was charged with conspiracy, operating a continuing drug enterprise and using weapons during drug deals. He also was accused of money laundering because he allegedly had lieutenants in the group use drug profits to buy several luxury cars. The next day Alpo appeared before U.S. Magistrate Alan Kay and refused to waive extradition to Virginia. Kay ordered him detained pending a removal hearing on November 15. Alpo said little during the brief hearing but sniffled loudly as tears welled in his eyes. His wife Natasha, who Alpo's attorney, Thomas Abinante, said was in the truck when he was arrested, cried throughout the hearing. As he left, Alpo told an associate to look after her. Abinante, who told Kay that he had been hired by Alpo, instructed court personnel not to interview his client for background information routinely compiled to determine whether a defendant is eligible for bond. According to the affidavit, Alpo was indicted on federal drug charges in July 1990 with 2 other men, but the indictment against Alpo was dismissed when he remained a fugitive. At the time their trial began. Alpo spent months in the DC jail. He was still protected by Wayne Perry. Perry had people watching Alpo's back in the jailhouse. A lot of inmates wanted Alpo dead for having Michael Frey killed. On the outside, Alpo had money hidden. He was planning to fight the charges in the beginning. Alpo had $750,000 stashed in the house that he bought in Maryland for Michelle's family. The money was inside a briefcase stashed in the basement. One day, Alpo sends his wife to get the briefcase from out the basement. He knew that the feds were about to hit the house. Alpo tell his wife to give the briefcase to Michelle's uncle who lived in the house. Michelle's uncle was told to hide the briefcase. No one but Alpo had the combination to the briefcase at the time. Michelle shared the house with her aunt and uncle. Her uncle done work for Alpo in the past. Sometimes he would drive kilos from New York City to Maryland for Alpo. He gained Alpo's trust. Michelle was ready to move out of the house. She tells Alpo and Alpo tell her to get the briefcase from her uncle. Alpo gives her the combination to the briefcase and tell her to not open it in front of no one. Michelle was supposed to only get $10,000 from out the briefcase for an apartment and furniture. Michelle didn't listen. She opened the briefcase in front of her aunt and uncle. The money began disappearing slowly. Michelle and her family pretty much stole all of Alpo's money. They fed him a bunch of lies. Alpo's wife Natasha warned him that this would happen. The feds, who were investigating Donnell Porter's kidnapping and murder back in New York, believed that Alpo was responsible for it. The Porter family not only thought that Alpo filled rich, they thought that he kidnapped and tortured 12-year-old Donnell. Alpo was facing life in prison. He began cooperating with the feds in '92. Not only did he tell on his DC enforcers, he admitted to all of the murders that he was a part of. Alpo was now sitting in Alexander Detention Center in Virginia facing his original charges. Peanut and his girlfriend were already sentenced to life because it took the feds almost 2 years to catch Alpo. By '93, Wayne Perry and his goons were all arrested. Shorty Pop was killed in '92. He was wanted for several murders, including the Dementio Benson murder. Alpo even told the feds where to find the murder weapons. He told them that some of the weapons were stashed in Wayne Perry's van. The feds also found the blood of Alveda Hopkins. In the van. Not only was Alpo facing life in prison, he was facing the death penalty in DC as well. Alpo even confessed to Rich Porter and 3 stick-up kids' murders in New York City. He made it clear to the feds that he wasn't involved in Don L. Porter's murder. Wayne Perry and his crew were all sentenced to life in prison. They all confessed to the murders to avoid the death penalty. Alpo went to serve 25 years at ATX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado. Alpo was happy with the outcome. He knew that he'd be free someday. He was only 26 years old at the time. His life wasn't over. Alpo was now a living legend in the streets. His name was known by every hustler in New York and DC. He was also known in the hip-hop world. Rappers such as Dougie Fresh, Heavy D and LL Cool J all hung around Alpo. Even a young Puff Daddy partied and stood on corners with Alpo. Alpo was the reason Puff Daddy became a member of the Harlem Street Crew, the same gang. In the late 80s, Alpo allegedly tried to murder singer Keith Sweat for sleeping with his girlfriend. A gangster by the name of Peter Shue saved Sweat's life. Shue allegedly warned Alpo not to touch Sweat. Alpo was released from prison in 2015. He began living under a United States Witness Protection Program in Lewiston, Maine, under the name Abraham G. Rodriguez. He began working at a warehouse of a Pepsi distributor, and then he got into construction work, including a business that cleared out commercial space. He moved into a 3-bedroom apartment on College Street. Neighbors say that they saw an ever-changing variety of women come visit Alpo. He had, they said, a lot of girlfriends. Alpo didn't keep a low profile. He would often come to Harlem, New York to hang out. He was still loved in Spanish Harlem. It wouldn't be long before he was back in the game. Alpo stayed in the swing of things. Heroin was now huge on the streets again. Alpo allegedly began wholesaling top-quality heroin. He allegedly had young hustlers from his old neighborhood working for him. In 2019, Alpo and filmmaker Troy Reed began working on a documentary. In the preview of the documentary, the two visit the location where Rich Porter's body was found. That only opened old wounds in Harlem. The Porter family were disappointed. Rich sister Patricia even went to social media. Alpo still had some people in fear. He allegedly made some gangsters who were talking down on him take pictures with him and shake his hand in public. Rapper Jim Jones released a mixtape by the name of The Ghost of Rich Porter. Alpo allegedly questioned Jim Jones about the title. He thought that it was disrespectful. Jones allegedly shook Alpo's hand after making it clear that he respected him. YouTuber by the name of King Earner did a lot of videos on Alpo calling him rats. The videos attracted Alpo's attention. In 2019, Alpo's mother and his sister Monica both died only days apart. That put Alpo in a dark place. He warned King Earner to stop posting videos about him. He told King Earner that he had just lost his mother and sister. He made it clear that he don't care about murdering King Earner. As I said before, Alpo was still loved in Spanish Harlem. He would sit on his Harley Davidson bike in the projects playing loud music on the stereo at 3:30 in the morning. On the morning of October 31, 2021 at 3:30 a.m., Alpo was fatally shot in Harlem, New York. While sitting in his 2017 Dodge Ram, 27-year-old Shaquem Parker was charged for the murder. Parker allegedly harbored a grudge with Alpo over a road rage incident that happened months before the killing. Alpo was 55 years old. He is now a legend, whether you like him or not. He's a part of Harlem history. If it wasn't for him, there would be no Paid in Full movie. Well, this was the real Alpo Martinez story. Thanks for watching. See you next time.